for Palestinians in the crosshairs.
The humanitarian situation is so catastrophic that even with a permanent ceasefire, hundreds of thousands of Gazans are going to be at risk of death as a consequence of the spread of disease.
With the joy of freedom for those who've been held hostage and released comes the emotional recovery to find their way back to a semblance of normalcy.
Many people will initially feel, unsurprisingly, a huge amount of elation, but when you've been detained for a long period of time, it can be very disorientating to come back into the sort of normal part of society.
And world leaders meet for the COP28 climate conference, the implications for millions living in places that will become uninhabitable. Join us on The Voice of America as we explore the issues in the news. Hi there, I'm Lori London in Washington. Israel's warplanes pounded Gaza on Friday, sending wounded and dead Palestinians into hospitals and residents fleeing into the streets as its war against Hamas resumed after talks to extend a week-old truce broke down. In a taped statement, Israeli government spokesman Eylon Levy accused Hamas of violating the terms of their fragile ceasefire
by failing to release all the kidnapped women as it was obligated to do so, and kidnapped children, and by resuming rocket fire.
The United Nations human rights chief has described the resumption of fighting in Gaza as catastrophic and pressed for all participants and countries with influence to redouble efforts to ensure a ceasefire. Associated Press correspondent Charles de Ledesma reports.
UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Volker Turk says the situation in Gaza is beyond crisis point as more Palestinians risk being killed or forcibly displaced to already severely overcrowded and unsanitary parts of Gaza. Turk added, recent comments by Israeli political and military leaders indicate they're planning to expand and intensify the military offensive and are very troubling. Turk reminded all parties to the conflict of their obligation to allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need throughout Gaza. I'm Charles de Ledesma.
Medics and witnesses said the bombing was the most intensive in the southern Gaza Strip, where hundreds of thousands of Gazans have been sheltering from fighting further north. Houses in central and northern areas were also hit. Earlier this week, the World Health Organization called for the safeguarding of Gaza's vulnerable health infrastructure, warning the war-torn enclave faces an increased risk of epidemics and challenges in detecting infectious diseases. Mike Ryan, head of the WHO's Health Emergencies Program.
We are seeing a complete collapse of the higher level infrastructure of the Gaza health system. It is just the most basic of needs that can be met now.
And I spoke on Thursday with Doctors Without Borders pediatric and intensive care physician Dr. Tanya Haj Hassan when the fragile ceasefire was still intact to learn of the dire situation her medical colleagues on the ground are describing. As she noted then, a restart of bombing would be unfathomable.
We're hearing nothing from clinicians that are currently in the north of Gaza. The communication has been completely cut off between the north and the south of Gaza. We hear from clinicians in the south of Gaza, where 1.7 million people have been displaced, so the majority of Gaza's population. And most of my conversations with them actually just revolve around how they're doing, how their families are doing, how they're coping and surviving. And then they usually voluntarily talk about the work that they're doing from a medical standpoint. So in terms of how they're doing themselves, they're displaced. Most of them left the north with just the clothes on their back. So they describe being very cold and trying to find warmer pajamas, jackets for them and their family members as winter approaches. They have lived in various types of makeshift accommodations. So some of them were housing in schools and then had to move. Some were in tents. Some have found apartments where they're living with other families in a very small space. They have very little, if any, access to water, both for drinking and hygiene purposes. And they describe having very difficult access to food. And they're doctors and medical professionals whose homes, some of them whose homes I've visited, and their day-to-day life, they were living in very comfortable homes. One of the doctors mentioned not knowing if her home still existed or not in the north and not being able to go back. So for the majority of Gaza's population, which has been displaced south, they're unable to go north to bury their dead, to see whether their houses have been destroyed, and to collect anything from their houses, including warmer clothes. What we've heard also from some of them that are are working in hospitals in the south is that they've been receiving a lot of gunshot wounds from civilians who have tried to travel north to bury dead or to search for their loved ones under the rubble, and they get shot on the way during this humanitarian pause. In terms of what we're hearing about the healthcare conditions in the south, there are, I believe, a total of around 36 hospitals in the Gaza Strip and only 7 that are still functioning. Those 7 hospitals are in the south, only one of which has capacity to conduct the kind of complex surgeries that are needed for many of the trauma patients. So really, they're working at less than half, anywhere between 25 and 50% capacity of the